Hello, welcome to Code with Eddie. This is our fourth lecture and we'll be talking about creating the game entities in our game window. So far, what have we done? Let's run our code and see what we've done. So far, we've been able to create this game window and we've been able to create the start button. And when we click the start button, it's going to be disabled and then give us this good black screen where we want to be drawing our game game entities. And also we've also be able to create the game loop function that loops and try to create about 60 frames every seconds. So that's what we've done. So now let's go and draw our first entity. So we need to create an abstract class called game entity. Game entity, we'll make it abstract. Good. Game entity. Good. Now in this our game entity class, we want to be able to perform to give properties of every object in the game. So every object in the game is going to have this property protected. We are giving it protected because we want the children to be able to access this same property. So every object has the x coordinate in the game window and the y coordinate Every object has this private, we're calling it private because we might not be using it, game entity type. The entity type, which will be an enum entity type. So we're gonna create this enum. Yep, this is the enum, and this enum will be helping us to define the kind of players we will need in our game. So we will need players like, we will need a player, an enemy, and we also need an annoying enemy. So an annoying enemy. So let's just go right away and paste this entity type in our project. So the entity type in this project will be in charge of giving the type of a player. So we have a player, we have an enemy, and we have an annoying enemy. These are the different entities we have in our game. So for now we are creating just the player. So we'll set the entity type there. And the next thing which we're going to be setting is the velocity. You can call it speed if you want. Velocity in the x direction, and we also have the velocity in the y direction. So these are the properties of every entity in our window, in our game window. So these are the properties. Let's go right away and generate the constructor. So you can just use your Eclipse to generate the constructor, and we're going to be using the x, the y, and the entity type field. So we just say new. Let's just add the velocity type, but we're going to be setting it to 0. So velocity type, we're going to use 0. Initially they have no speed, and we're going to take it out from the parameter list. We just have x, y, and the entity type. X, y, and the entity type generated for us. Good. So now let's generate our getters and setter method. So we go to getter setters, select all you want getter setters for, of course. Good. So you have your getters and setters method. and this is the abstract method for every game entity. So let's create our first game entity. The first game entity will be player, new class, and we call it player. Good. Now our player class, we need to inherit from all game entities, so we extend. So a player is a game entity. So we extend from game entity, and we need to add a constructor. Now our constructor of a player class don't need to have game entity because we are the entity type, because we already know the entity type is a player, so we just have to give the entity type in the constructor as player from the enum. So we have the entity type. Let's add a few abstract methods in a game entity class, which we might be using, which every object should be able to implement. So we are adding these two abstract methods right after the constructor. So every object in this class, let me import it, import from graphics, good. Every object should be able to implement, every child of the game entity should implement update and render. Update will just basically do the logic of the current location, and render will basically write this logic on the game window. So in our game entity class, we will be asked to add this unimplemented method, which is update and render. These are the methods which we are going to be overriding in the game entity. Now, we'll come later in the lecture to talk about the update, but in this lecture, we just want to be able to display an entity in our game window. So what do? So we just need to do the render part of this functionality. So the render is we just render with the graphics object. We're able to set a color for it. So our player is going to be having a white color, white for our player, and our entity is just rectangle. So we fill the rectangle, and the X location will be the X location from the entity class inherited, and the Y location from the entity class inherited too. And the size of our player will just be 32. You can give any other number. Whatever size you give, it will be the size of the entity in the game window. So that's what we've done. We've created this white colored rectangle of size 32. It's actually a square, equal size in our player. So that's our player. But now this player is still unable to appear in the window because we have not yet connected the player to the window. To do that, we are going to be having to create a new class called a handler. This handler class will be in charge to connect all our entities to the window. So the handler class will be having a list of every entity in the window. So I have a private list of game entity. I'll call it game entity. There are many of them. New game, new. You can use array list or a linked list, whatever list you're comfortable with. I'm just gonna use array list. Now import my array list from Java util. Good. Now in this my list, I should be able to have two methods, two public methods. The first one is a public method to do all the updates of every object in the entity. So I'm going to call it update game. So it updates the position of every entity in my game window. And I'll just have to go through every entity in the game window. So I'll call them game entity. Every game entity. Entity. So this dot game entity. So you just go through every game entity, and for each of the game entity is gonna be calling the render method. So you just call this render method for every game entity. No, sorry, not the render method, the update method. Good. The update method for every entity. Update method. And we copy the same code and do it for render. So we are done the update, and we're gonna call render game, which is gonna draw every entity on our window. I hope you're understanding. So we have the update that goes through every entity and update their position, and the entity, the render game that goes through every entity in the game window, and render that's draw them on the window. So it renders them on the window render. So we're going to be passing the graphics G. Graphics from here. Good. So just go through every entity and pass this graphic in the window. So that's it. Let's do a method to be able to add entities to this list. So we have public void add game entity. This method is gonna take an entity, and we're just gonna call this dot game entity dot add this entity to the window. And let's just add a remove entity. So remove, just so that you know how to remove the entity. And if we want to get every entity in our window, we can generate the getter method for every entity. So we need a getter, select getter, okay. And this method here generated will be able to give us every entity in our window. So we are done with the handler class. Now to add the player in the window, we have to go to the game. So this is our game window. We want to be able to add players in our game window. So the first thing to do is to create a game handler. Now the game handler object will be able to add these entities in our game window. So here we'll call the game handler object handler equals to new handler. We'll put in the constructor, so I can create a fee of handler right above here. Now we have the handler, it has a list of every object, but there's no object inside. So let's go and add the first object in our handler dot add entity. So we are adding a player. Add a player. So let's create this player that we'll be adding right here. So player equals to new new player. And to create a player, we need to give the X and the Y position, the initial position. So let's just try to put it below. I'm gonna explain this number in a couple of seconds. Let's just put this number which is close to the bottom of the page. We have a player and we've added a player. So after adding the player, if you run it, nothing is still gonna happen. If I click, nothing is displayed here on the window. So how do I get to see my game object? I have not drawn them yet, that's why. So I'm only looping through the game object, but I'm not drawing them because I'm not doing the render function. So I have to go now to my render function. Let's do the update. In the update function, we are just gonna be calling handler dot update game. So you're just gonna change all the position of every, and in this render function, right after here, this position is very important. You want to be able to draw the black screen and put the size of the game object before drawing the entity inside. So in this function, you're gonna call, in this position, you're gonna call handler dot render, and in our render, you're gonna be passing this graphic object which we created with the buffer strategy. So you pass in this graphic and it's gonna render this graphic. So you're gonna go through every entity and render the graphics, render it on this entity. Just go through, because this function is a list. Yeah, you go through every entity, and so far in our game we just have one player which we've added to that list, which is player at this position X and this position Y. So now if I run it, we should be having our entity display. Come on, why keep disappearing? Okay, so this is our player here at this position close to the bottom. So this position is the position I gave here. Let me try to explain this position. Stick it by the side. Now this position is the 270 and 550. The 00 position is right at the top of the window, at the top left hand corner. This is 00. So if you're counting down, we keep increasing the pixels and coming down and coming down. So when we are closer to the size of the window, which is about 200 and something, is where the Y, which is about 500 and something, is where this is the Y direction. So Y is this height from the object to the top, and the X is this distance 270 from the left to the right. So that's when we've positioned this object. You can go around and mess up with this, try to change the numbers and see how you position the object relatively to the game window height and width. And that's it. That's how to position, to create an entity object. In the next slide, we are going to be creating some key events in our player object, in our player entity, and we want to be able to move this player from left to right and every direction we want to be going. So thank you. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Please don't forget to subscribe. Okay, see you in the next lecture. Bye bye.